Well, welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be starting a new chapter, Shaping a New Nation. So, we just looked at the whole American Revolution and talked about the movement and then the fight and then the victory of American independence. But now, new questions have to be answered now that independence has been won. And that is, where do we go from here? How do we govern this new nation that we've created? How do we embody those revolutionary principles of republicanism and rights and limited government and all of those sorts of things? How do we embody that into some sort of government? So that is mostly, of course, and most of what we'll be looking at and talking about in this particular chapter is the writing and the foundations that are present in the United States Constitution. But before we do that, we have to look at what the United States' first government was. And some of you might be thinking, isn't there only one Constitution? Hasn't there only ever been one Constitution for the United States? And the answer to that is no. The United States Constitution that we have operated under for quite a long time is not the only government that the United States has operated under, and it was not the first government that the United States operated under. We first had what we call the Confederation Period, which lasted from independence in 1776 until this governing document was thrown out and the Constitution written in its place in 1787. So roughly the first 10 years of the United States' existence existed under a different government, one that, as we're going to see today, did not work out too well. In fact, the first government really failed, and the Constitution was written as a replacement, and I think you will agree, one that has done a pretty good job as it has been in place ever since then. So today we're going to look at this government, this first government for the United States, talk a little bit about what it was like, what powers did it have. We're going to spend a few minutes talking about the one major success that it had, but mostly talking about its failures, its shortcomings, the things that it did not do well, because obviously it didn't do a lot of things very well if it ends up getting replaced with the United States Constitution just a short 10 years later. So before the United States Constitution, the first national government for the United States was set up in a different document called the Articles of Confederation. So the Articles of Confederation was the first government for the United States, the first attempt at a national government for the United States. You could argue that the Articles of Confederation is like the first Constitution. So this was a document that was written up about 1777 or so by the Second Continental Congress. So once the independence is declared in 1776, the Second Continental Congress works to draft the Articles of Confederation to create the first legitimate and what was intended to be permanent government for the new United States. And the Articles of Confederation sets up a very specific type of government. And confederation means something. To say that the United States is a confederation, to set up the United States as a confederation, is very specific. A confederation means it's a loose union, and that's what the Articles of Confederation does, is it sets up a loose union or a loose alliance of states. To say that it's loose means that it's not really tight. So this is aligning the states together in some kind of a, mutual agreement for mutual protection, but it is not a very strong government. And that's exactly the point with the Articles of Confederation, is this creates a very weak, very loose national government. Think of it as having a lot more flexibility in where the states, yes, they are agreeing to work together to a degree. They are agreeing that they need to work together, particularly when it dealt to foreign affairs and things along those lines. But for the most part, the Articles of Confederation, and this is really important, keeps most of the power with the individual states. The individual states truly do come first in this whole arrangement. The individual states have a lot of power here, and they're not surrendering too much of that to a national government. Now, this wasn't without precedent. This is kind of how things had been done up until now. Basically, what the Articles of Confederation is doing is it's just sort of giving more legitimate authority to the Second Continental Congress and making that the official government in perpetuity, just as long as wherever. This also has precedent in Native American governments. The idea of a confederation had always been sort of those founding fathers, those colonial leaders that thought the United States needed, or rather the colonies, needed to unite under some kind of central government, a confederation was more what they had in mind, loosely based on the ideas of the Iroquois Confederation. And there were other Native American groups that formed confederations where individual tribes were still free to do their individual things, have their individual pursuits, have their own laws, have their own ways of doing things, but then be together for purposes of defense and trade and stuff like that. That's exactly what this is creating here. It is a loose union of states in which most of the power resides with the states. And you have to remember that that's always how it had been. When these states were colonies, they always had a lot of individual autonomy. And so it wouldn't make sense to them to surrender some of that power to a bigger national government. It also makes sense because this is being done in the midst of the Revolutionary War, in which the colonists at that time, or rather the Americans, are fighting against a government that they feel is too powerful, fighting against a king that they feel is too powerful. So it would make sense that they would create a government that isn't very powerful. And the government under the Articles of Confederation isn't very powerful. Under the Articles of Confederation, the United States national government consisted of a one-house Congress, and that's it. So a one-house Congress, a legislator, a group to make the law, and only some kinds of laws for the new United States. And that's it. There's no president. There is no executive of any kind. There's no court system. None of that. So it's a one-house Congress, and that's all. Every state in that Congress was represented equally. So every state, no matter how big or small, no matter how many people lived in it or how many people didn't live in it, they all got equal vote, equal say in that Congress. And you can see how that sounds pretty fair, but later we'll see some reasons why others argued that it wasn't. That Congress, one-house Congress, one chamber, with every state having an equal vote, did have some powers. They could declare war. They could raise an army. They could borrow money. They could regulate external trade. They could deal with or make arrangements with Native American tribes. But that's about it. That's about the extent of their major powers. You'll notice that all of those powers tend to focus on foreign arrangements, foreign powers, war. So you see, that's kind of how they saw this national union, as it was really for purposes of being united in a conflict and, representing all of them when it came to, treaties or agreements with foreign countries or with Native American nations, those sorts of things. But there's a lot of things that they can't do. And for the most part, when we look at the Articles of Confederation, we will mostly, and I'm going to be talking about each of these things individually. So we'll go one at a time there. We will look at its failures, the things that it couldn't do and where they miscalculated a lot of things, because this is such a weak government. It's going to turn out that it doesn't have the ability to handle a lot of the problems that the country had. And it wasn't strong enough to really create a nation. It doesn't create a nation. That wasn't really the point. But we want to start though with the one thing that they did do well. There's one area of policy where the Articles of Confederation did have a resounding success. They did have the authority to deal with this, and they actually came up with something that worked very, very well, and something that worked far beyond the Confederation itself. Long after the Confederation will have been tossed out and a new government put in its place, these policies would still be working. These policies would still be in place. And that is in regard to Western land policy. Now, what that means, if you remember, the Treaty of Paris 1783, the new United States got land all the way to the Mississippi River, which is partially shown on this map. This is partly the Mississippi River, and of course, it would continue all the way down to where it empties into the Gulf of Mexico. So all of this is your Western territory. Over here, this would be your 13 states by that point, and then all of this Western territory that eventually does become numerous states, including Alabama, is that Western territory. Well, there's all kind of questions here about that Western territory. How are we going to settle it? What's going to be the process? What's the plan? What's going to happen to that land? First and foremost, the biggest problem you had originally was that states were fighting over that land. You had states like New York and Virginia and several others that were claiming some of this to belong to them, that were saying this is part of Virginia or this is part of Pennsylvania. Some of them claiming absolutely ridiculous amounts of land, basing it on sometimes their like original colonial charters that basically said they had land as far as, forever, that really had no endpoint. And so they used that as basis to say this land belonged to them. There are portions of this territory territory that were being claimed sometimes by as many as 3 states, and the states are all squabbling back and forth with each other over who gets to control it. The Confederation Congress does successfully convince the states to give up all of those land claims, to basically say it belongs to none of you. It is not Virginia. It is not Pennsylvania. It is not New York. It is none of, it's all not the property, but it's all under the jurisdiction. It's under the purview of this national government, and the national government will make those decisions. No individual state is going to actually get any of that land. So they successfully do that. And then once they get the states to give up those claims, they will then pass 2 really important laws that have a significant impact on the settlement and the development of these Western territories. So keep in mind also, I think that's kind of weird for us. When we talk about the West today, we are thinking probably of California and places like that. We must remember that in this period, the West would be, Kentucky and, Ohio and places like that, because the western border of the United States at this point is the Mississippi River. So the first law that they're going to pass that turns out to be a big success is the Land Ordinance of 1785. And you don't have to know quite as much about this one. I'm not going to give you too many details about it. But basically what the Land Ordinance of 1785 did was it set up a pattern for how this land would be distributed and how it would be sold off. So a uniform pattern of how this land is going to be divided up, and it created this nice little grid pattern. Plots of land would be yay big, it put like a standard size on that, and they would be sold off individually that way. And then also the national government would get the money from those land sales, and that would pad out the treasury a little bit, help pay for some of the war expenses, those sorts of things. The reason that's important is because it sets up a process of how this land could be distributed, which is just an organizational thing, but it also promoted, or it led to the idea that this land would mostly be their smaller pieces of land. So the land was kept in smaller pieces and therefore more affordable. And it's going to be more likely that that land is going to be purchased by, individual people just starting a small farm, as opposed to that land being snatched up by a handful of wealthy landowners and it becoming like a handful of big wealthy estates like plantations. So they're trying to make it more accessible. They're trying to make it more affordable, and they're trying to make it something where, more people would have access to that land. More people would be able to get land and farm it and make their life and all of that kind of thing, as opposed to it becoming something kind of like the South, where you have, a handful of people that are the landowners and everybody else living off of that. So it's a more egalitarian, they saw it as a more equal, a more fair way to distribute that land. And it's going to mean that the Northwest is always, or at least for a long time, going to be made up of smaller farmers, smaller independent farms, as opposed to big plantations and estates. More importantly, though, is the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 is often considered to be the Articles of Confederation's greatest accomplishment. This is the thing that they did the best. And the Land Ordinance is very important, but there's kind of some bigger deal things going on in the Northwest Ordinance. The Northwest Ordinance does a couple of things. One big thing is it sets up a organized process for how these new territories these lands would eventually become states. And first of all, I want to emphasize Northwest Ordinance is specifically referring to what was known as the Northwest Territory, or what is sometimes today called the Old Northwest, which is all this right here that you're seeing. So it's modern day Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, parts of Wisconsin. That is the Northwest. So that's where they're talking about, and that's what the Northwest would have pertained to, is this area right here. So it set up a process as to how these areas would eventually become states. So setting up that at a certain number of settlers, and you don't necessarily need to know the numbers, but it's 5,000. At 5,000 people, it becomes a territory. And it being a territory, that's when it gets a name, like the Ohio Territory or the Illinois Territory and all of that. Being a territory is a bit like being a colony, in that at that point, the difference is they start getting some self-government. They can, they're not totally under the purview of the national government anymore. They can elect a territorial legislature. They can start making some of their own territorial laws. They can elect a territorial governor. They start to get that self-government and that representation there. At another number of settlers, again, you don't need to know the number, but it is believe 60,000, then they can apply for statehood. So at that point, they can petition Congress basically to add them as a new state. And most importantly in all of that, when that new state is added, it would be on equal footing with all of the other states, meaning that it is the same as the state when its first day as a state. It is the same. Its citizens' rights, its citizens' voice, its votes in Congress, all of those things are the exact same as the original states. In other words, new states are not somehow inferior to old ones, and old states are not superior to new ones, that they're all the same. And that sounds pretty basic and normal to us, but at the time that was completely unheard of. This was a really new idea. We have to think of it as these being a territory. It's a bit like being a colony, like these people once were. And the notion of empire before this had been when you expand and you settle new territories and you settle new lands, like how Europeans had expanded and settled new territories and settled new lands. Those new lands that were in the distance, that were not close to the mother country, were somehow inferior. They weren't as good. They were not treated the same as the colonists felt they were not treated the same. This is tossing all of that out the window and saying that the new is just as good as the old. And we're getting rid of this whole idea of second-class colonies and second-class citizens and second-class, new territories, that the new frontier is not just a barren wasteland, and that you're not giving that up. The Northwest Ordinance also promises basic legal and political rights to people that move out in those territories, essentially saying when you go and move out into these territories that are, in their mind, unsettled and all of that, you're not giving up your rights, that you take that with you. Again, you have to think about their background as colonists. They felt like it was assumed that they did give up some of their rights. They weren't guaranteed those same things when they moved to the colonies, for example. But this is promising that, thus making westward expansion very exciting and encouraging westward expansion. And that was part of it. And westward expansion is going to be a very important theme. And we'll have, and the West, for a long time, starting here, probably even before this, but for a long time, the West represents freedom. The West represents new opportunity. The West represents this place where you can pick up and go and, leave your problems behind and have success and start over and all those sorts of cliche things, but nevertheless, they're there. And the Northwest Ordinance contributes to that by creating this sense of, there is equality out there, and it becomes kind of this great equalizer sort of a situation. And speaking of equality and a great equalizer situation, the last major important thing that the Northwest Ordinance does is it banned slavery in the Northwest Territory. So it says that these territories will not have slavery. And so for the very first time, we are going to see areas settled and states added that never once, not for a single day, ever had slavery. So the Northwest was always sort of intended to be a place that was more free, more equal, more than some of the other regions. And that's going to really play into their personality a little bit. And we're starting to see for the first time this division between slave states and free states. In the colonial era, it was legal everywhere. And now we're starting to see, because the Northwest Ordinance has been closed to slavery and some of our northern states are beginning to abolish slavery, we're starting to see that split and that divide, which will only continue. Now, when it comes to the Northwest Ordinance and the Western Land Policy, like I said, that is the extent of their success. It is successful because it works, and it works well beyond the Articles of Confederation itself. Even well after the Articles of Confederation have been scrapped, those land laws would still be being used. And that process set up by the Northwest Ordinance for adding new states would continue to be used even when the United States expanded beyond the Northwest Territory. So even when the United States gains more land past the Mississippi, that process would still be used. But like I said, for the most part, when we think about the Articles of Confederation, it is about problems, 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 one after the other, which you can see in this cartoon above me. You can already see what some of those problems are. So let's break down some of the things that they could not do, some of the issues that caused. So we said Congress can declare war, they can borrow money, They can make treaties, things that you would need to do when it comes to foreign affairs and, diplomatic resolutions to problems, so forth, so on. But there's a lot of powers they intentionally did not give this Congress. The states might be able to do these things, but the national government couldn't. And while what they were trying to do was create a government that would not be too powerful, what they end up is doing is creating a government that's so weak it cannot function. And so let's take a look at those things. A big problem with the Articles of Confederation was that Congress didn't have the power to regulate commerce, internal commerce, that is, or what we actually call interstate commerce. They can regulate external trade like imports and exports, but they cannot regulate trade within the state. So they cannot regulate trade between states. Now, you might wonder, why in the world does that cause a problem? Well, if the national government's not able to regulate trade between states, I mean, each individual state is. And so every state is making their own laws about trade from one state to another, basically meaning that they are taxing each other. So states are taxing each other's goods. Virginia is charging Maryland to use this port, and so forth and so on. And they're all slapping these really, really big fees on each other to pass goods from one place to the other, or to use each other's ports, or to cross each other's borders. And what that is leading to is disputes, arguments. There are legitimate, serious arguments between multiple states, in some cases getting close to coming to blows. I mean, some of them are ready to fight each other over some of these disputes. Congress has no way to deal with it. They can't pass a law to, fix the problem. There is no court system for states to sue each other and iron out their disputes. There's no way to deal with this. So you have states bickering back and forth nearly to the point of civil war over this issue of taxation and trade. They also have no power to coin money. Individual states coined their own money, which is really weird to think about, but you did not have a national currency under the Articles of Confederation. There was no money for the United States of America. You had Virginia money and New York money and Pennsylvania money, and the list goes on. And so for one thing, that creates confusion. It creates economic instability when you don't have a common currency. It creates more disputes among the states, as they did not always accept each other's currency, or they would argue about the value of it. But probably one of the biggest problems is that since the states are coining money, they're also doing that unregulated, and there's no oversight. And that can create some serious economic problems, because when you just print paper money, which is what a lot of them were doing because they were in dire financial straits as a result of the war, and had been since the war was going on, that leads to serious inflation. And that's the big problem here, is that there is a massive inflation problem on top of some other economic woes. And the national government can't do anything about it. They can't tell the states to stop. They cannot dictate what the value of that currency is. And inflation is just going out of control. And there's nothing really that can be done about it. What is sometimes argued as one of the biggest flaws with the Articles of Confederation is the fact that they did not have the power to tax. Now, it's pretty obvious as to why they would put that in place. Obviously, they are in the middle of fighting a war against unfair taxation, or that being a big part of it. And so this national government did not have the power to tax. Now, the states can, and the states in some cases are taxing quite heavily, but the national government has no power to tax. And we as Americans, of course, have very, very adverse feelings to taxation, and naturally so. No one likes to pay taxes. But the thing we have to remember is that taxes pay for things that governments need to do, like raising military, for example, and defense. Some of those very things that the Confederation Congress was charged with doing, they're not going to have the funds to do. They're not going to be able to have the funds to raise a military, to pay veterans of the Revolutionary War, to pay back debts from the war. And that's a big thing. Is a huge amount of debt to pay back from the war, and they really don't have much of a way of raising that debt. And while none of us like taxation, it's also not good for the country to be broke. The United States is on the verge of bankruptcy here, and there's a baby country trying to prove to the world that it's legitimate and it can't pay its bills, and that's really going to cause a lot of problems. In addition to those things, we also have some sort of structural problems, not just problems with the Congress powers that they didn't have, but there's some other sort of structural problems with other parts of the government. As I mentioned, the Articles of Confederation government consisted of just a one-house Congress. That's it. There was no executive branch, meaning there's no president, there's no executive council or anything along those lines. There is no person, there is no group that is charged with actually making sure the law gets followed, because that's the function of an executive, is to execute or to make sure the law is actually carried out. With no executive branch, a lot of the things that Congress does do really turn out to be little more than recommendations, because there's no way to actually make sure that it gets done, and there's no follow through. There's no way accountability there, so that causes some problems. We also have a lot of things going wrong, problems that the Articles of Confederation government, because of its structure, cannot deal with. One of those being there are a lot of foreign problems. Debt is already one of them. There are also numerous violations of the Treaty of Paris that are happening. And by that, I mean the Treaty of Paris, 1783. There are violations going on both the American and the British side. On the American side, you have states that are not paying back debts like they were supposed to. There are states that are not returning property to loyalists like they are supposed to. And again, without an executive, without a lot of power, there's really no way for the national government to address this and to force the states to do any of those things, which, as you can imagine, makes the United States look really bad. If we're, again, this baby country trying to prove ourselves, trying to get on our feet, and we can't hold our old agreements, that's pretty bad, and that's threatening. And in retaliation for that, Britain is also not following parts of the Treaty of Paris. Mainly, they have not fully evacuated a lot of those Western territories. They were supposed to evacuate their troops from everywhere and from some of those forts and outposts. They are still there in some of those Western territories and taking their time about it, kind of saying, well, you're not doing this, so we're not going to do that. And once again, no way to really do anything about it. So all of that shows and exposes a lot of weaknesses to other countries, which is a particular problem. Another a problem with foreign issues under the foreign relations under the Articles of Confederation is there are also border disputes. There's a border dispute with Spain over exactly where the boundary of Spanish Florida was. There's some questions there, and there's parts that Spain is claiming are part of Spanish Florida that the United States is claiming is theirs. So that's causing some issues. There are problems about use of the port of New Orleans, which at this time was Spanish territory, and that was a very important port for the United States. It needed access to it. They were arguing over that, and there were attempts to try to resolve it, and it just went nowhere. Without an executive to sort of lead the charge on that, a person to sort of lead the way, and without a strong Congress, all those disputes cannot be resolved, or they don't get resolved. And so those things are just boiling over and festering and really threatening the security and therefore the independence of the United States. Finally, all this begs the question, why don't they just fix it? Why can't they just change it? Why don't they just give them the power to tax or address these problems? Well, that brings up another problem with the articles, and that's the amendment process. To amend means to change. So the amendment process would be the process of changing the Articles of Confederation. The amendment process is all but impossible. It's very, very difficult. It practically has to be unanimous. That's not exactly true, but pretty much true, that you'd have to have really all states, on board to support any changes that might be made. So every time a change is recommended, there's always going to be somebody that disagrees and somebody that, halts the whole process. So what we end up with, instead of a government that is, very, very mild and, everybody just kind of going about their merry way, what we end up with is a government that is flat broke, that is fighting amongst itself, that cannot uphold its own agreements, that can't force others to uphold agreements to them, and everything is just falling apart. And the economy is in terrible, terrible, terrible shape because they're trying to recover from the war and get finances in order for a new country, and it just was not possible with all the problems they were having. So next time we will look at how and why at least enough, not all people, but at least enough people say this isn't working, we've got to do something else, or this whole thing that we fought so long and hard for is going to be down the drain. So that's what we'll be looking at next time, and seeing some of the first attempts to revise the Articles of Confederation, which eventually turns in instead to an effort to just throw it out totally.